Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1994 film, The Flintstones. Now, before we get around to sharing more of my thoughts on the film, I would like to give a special shout out to Bronson for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, The Flintstones is one of those films that when it came out, it was a gigantic hit. It made a ton of money in the box office, a ton of money when it comes to merchandising, probably sold a ton of Happy Meals at McDonald's, but it was a flop critically. Critics really didn't like this film at all. And it gets like a 24% Rotten Tomatoes, and it doesn't have the best reputation critically, even to this day. And you know what? I've always had fun with this movie. I remember watching this a ton of times on VHS when I was a kid. So it's a film that I definitely do have some nostalgia for, but I will be honest. This film is at best a time waster. Like, it's good when it comes to elements like the production design, certain cast members, but the plot, it's not the best. It's also not really as funny as it could be. Honestly, I laughed more when it comes to films that aren't technically the Flintstones, but deal with prehistoric eras like Caveman. But it also isn't completely devoid of laughs or chuckles. I honestly think it's on par with like your average episode of the cartoon, which is fitting because this is an adaptation of that cartoon. The Flintstones cartoon I never really was super fond of. In fact, I would watch the live action film more than I would ever watch any of the cartoons. It's a cartoon series that I definitely have an appreciation for and a certain amount of respect for because of what it did for animation and what it was able to get away with during its era. But it's not really something that I've honestly ever really truthfully liked. So I'm not one of those Flintstones purists, so to speak, who is hard on the film because it's not like the cartoon. Uh, I kind of didn't mind that it wasn't like the cartoon. I was fine with it being the way that it was. And honestly, from what I remembered, it was like the cartoon in the first place. But I liked it more than the cartoon because it was live action. And it wasn't dealing with the limitations of cheap animation from the 50s or 60s. Now, the film was directed by Brian Levant, and this entire production was a labor of love, so to speak, from Levant and Spielberg. Spielberg is the reason why the film got made, because Steven Spielberg, for those of you who don't know who I'm talking about, which is probably next to no one, but just to be clear, Steven Spielberg is one of the producers of this film, and he had a dream, so to speak, to get a Flintstones movie made because he was a big fan of the cartoon, and because of his pull in the industry, if Spielberg wanted something to get made, it was gonna get made. But it was kind of stuck in development hell for a while. There was a script in the 80s that apparently was like Grapes of Wrath meets the Flintstones, which I find to be absolutely ridiculous. Like as weak and just mediocre as the script is for this version of the movie, a Grapes of Wrath Flintstones movie is infinitely worse. Grapes of Wrath and the Flintstones is an oxymoron. The two do not mix. Yeah, apparently the plot was involving Fred and Barney losing their jobs and then going around touring, well, not really touring, but trying to find work throughout a bedrock and meeting various different people along the way. And during their journey, they realize the value of friendship and family. And that's just not the right kind of vibe for a Flintstones movie. Like, oh, hey, kids, here's Fred and Barney. Oh, they got fired from their jobs and they're homeless now. And that they have to go try to scrounge for food and find work. And they're away from their wives and their kids. Yabba dabba doo. Like, I mean, what? Like, I've heard people say that it was like a commentary on the Great Depression. I'm like, the Flintstones and the Great Depression are not things that should be in the same sentence. But yeah, when Brian Levant was eventually hired because of the fact that he was a Flintstones fanatic, like Brian Levant is a legitimate Flintstones fan, like one of the biggest Flintstones fans out there. Like the guy loves the Flintstones. And Steven saw that and was like, you know what? He's worked with me before. He directed Beethoven, and that was a hit. Uh, Give him the job. Let's see what he can do. And when Levant was hired, all these other scripts were completely tossed out, understandably so. And you wound up having a different screenplay that was utilized for the final product. And when it comes to Levant's direction, I think he did a solid job. I think for this kind of movie that's shot pretty much on set for the majority of it, and it's very stylized, very cartoonish. Levant did a good job when it comes to shooting the scenes with that cartoonish energy and that mirth. And you can definitely tell that Levant had a real passion for the Flintstones, and you could really feel that in pretty much every scene, especially in the scenes where he's recreating the intro for the cartoon, or the sequences that really focus more on Fred and Barney and their friendship and them being pals, or the various different appliances that the Flintstones use in the house, or the scenes where they're driving their automobiles and they're using their feet. That's really where the direction shines the most, is when it comes to the stuff that really fits with the cartoon. Where it kind of falls a little flat is when it comes to the business espionage kind of scenes, the scenes that just have Fred sitting there in a desk, signing off on documents. Those are a little bit rough in terms of the fact that they're just very stodgy, and so is some of the scenes involving more effects, like the whole climax at the end with the machine. Like, it was really obvious that it was a work of like mechanics and plaster and so on and so forth. It looked incredibly cheap and fake. Like the rocks that were flying around, they looked like they were made out of styrofoam. So I think that there are some moments where Levant's direction kind of holds the film back at times. Like, he doesn't shoot the movie in a way where you can hide some of the lesser qualities of the sets or the effects. Like, there are moments where the way that he shoots them is loving and it just really puts them in a good light. But then there's other scenes where it puts them in a really bad light because it's like shot in the day, and he's not using a lot of shadows or a lot of other lighting, so then it becomes just blatantly obvious that you're just watching scenes that are performed on a set that, yes, it was built on a location, but but it still has that sound stagey look to it. The direction, though, did have a decent amount of variety when it comes to some of the angles and some of the zooms or pans or different kinds of shots and techniques that Levant decided to utilize for the film. Definitely, a lot of them were very cartoon uh, uh, like in terms of the vision that he had for it. And so there's a lot of scenes that look like a legitimate live action cartoon, but that's very fitting for the Flintstones film. So I would say consistency wise, other than John Goodman and Rick Moranis as Fred and Barney, uh, Brian Levant's direction is one of the more consistently good things about this film. Uh, the script by Thomas Parker, Jim Genowin, and Stephen E. D'Souza, on the other hand, not so much. This script really is what holds this film back. The cast, for the most part, I think the cast is really good, except for one glaring exception, which I will mention later. The director is a good pick because he's very passionate about the source material and really wants to do the movie. The production design by William Sandell, I believe that's who did it, is spectacular. Like, it's really impressive what the production designer was able to do when it comes to the set and just to make a bedrock come to life. Same thing goes for the visual effects and the practical effects that are used in the movie. Some really good puppetry, some early CGI of Dino that honestly holds up pretty well, uh, despite the age of the movie. So you have all these elements that should lead to a classic film, but the script is just lacking. Like, it just seems like it's one of the more forgettable episodes of the cartoon series. Like, when the cartoon series focused more on appealing to adults instead of families, and so you had certain plot lines that really only adults would really find that interesting. And here it is, rearing its ugly head again with this plot line about business espionage or stuff involving fraud, business fraud, and you're like, really? Like, that's the plot that you picked for the Flintstones film? This plot about Fred being set up by this greedy and snivelly businessman who decides to set him up and frame him for all these business deals that the guy is making on the side so we can steal all this money and embezzle it from the company. That's not really something that seems like a good fit for a Flintstones movie. And at times it's too serious, like the stuff involving Fred and Barney and they're falling out, the scenes involving Fred and his wife Wilma and them having their brief breakup, scenes with Barney and oh god, Betty. Yeah, Barney and Betty just being homeless with their kid on the side of the street somewhere. Well, it's not really the side of the street. It's in the middle of the desert. They're homeless in the middle of the desert. It's like it's like they didn't learn the lesson from the Grapes of Wrath storyline that some other writer came up with and decided to just copy some of those elements again. And the Flintstones is not a film that should be this serious. Like, you should just throw that out. Like, I understand the falling out between Fred and Barney. Like, I can deal with that, to be honest, because of the payoff. But Like, the other depressing stuff, cut that out of the movie. Like, what is that doing here? Like, I don't remember the film being that depressing when I was a kid because I guess I didn't have the context for those scenes. Now I do, and I'm like, that's a bummer. That's a dino-sized bummer. What is this? Why is this movie depressing now? There's also humor that is just way too mean-spirited, like the stuff about Wilma's mom. And there's even like a scene where Fred imagines her being eaten by a dinosaur. I'm like, well, that's a little bit too edgy for the Flintstones movie. And it just creates a very weird tone because there's scenes where it's taking itself really seriously and it's dramatic. Then you have like weird, edgy bits of humor, and then it's just straight kiddie stuff, like the scenes with Dino or some of the stuff that's just a straight up recreation of the cartoon. And you're like, pick a lane, pick a tone. It just makes the script just come across as very tonally inconsistent, and that is something that really hurts this film. Honestly, hurts any film is tonal inconsistency. And it doesn't help either that the comedy, it's mostly lame with, this type of puns that you saw in the cartoon. But what works for a cartoon from back in the day doesn't necessarily work in the same capacity for a 90s film. Like the rock puns and the dinosaur puns, they got old really quick, and they elicited more groans than they did laughter. But it's not all bad. It's one of those things where every now and then there's a little pop culture reference that was kind of funny. There's some sight gags that work. The script does a good job with the relationship and the friendship between the characters, specifically the friendship between Fred and Barney. So when they have their falling out, it genuinely does hurt because they're such good pals early on. I think the drama of having Barney be the one that swaps the test scores, or the tests, so to speak, for the aptitude test, for the promotion. Uh, I think that was a good choice. I think that was a good addition to the script. It created some genuinely solid drama. But when Fred, he makes all this money, he becomes rich, he becomes entitled. The way that things are written, he's too much of an asshole. So that's another thing where they take a little bit too seriously. They go way overboard with it. So it's not an instance in the film where, oh, it's kind of funny because of just how much of a jerk he is and he's over the top. It just comes across as mean spirited. Like, it's not that kind of thing where he's just spending irresponsibly. He just comes across like a total jerk off. And those scenes are really hard to watch as a result. And it makes his redemption arc not really as effective either. You don't root for his redemption because the transition from yabba dabba doo and hey, Barney, you're my pal, you're my friend. I'm gonna spend some of the last money that I have saved up so you can have a kid, to raging asshole is just, it's too quick of a transition, and it just also feels out of character. So that's the other problem. It's just so unrealistic. So when he switches like a flip of a coin, basically, like he's Two-Face, it's just something that doesn't click. And I think on paper and in theory, it's an idea that might work, but it's just not executed well. And then when it comes to the villain, it's not very memorable. It doesn't really come across as that intimidating, despite the fact that he's willing to kidnap Barney and Fred's kids and tie them up and have them go through a deadly, dastardly machine at the end. he still doesn't come across as that formidable of a villain. And there's this other stuff too, like the stuff with the secretary, which also doesn't make Fred look good. Like Fred just looks like a total douche there too, where he's just is basically, cheating on his wife. It doesn't, you don't see him have sex with the secretary, but it's implied, and it's definitely, you definitely show him think about it, or have an inkling to do it, which also doesn't hurt the character. Which also doesn't help. My bad. Doesn't help the characterization of Fred Flintstone. But yeah, despite these issues, like I said, there's a good groundwork. There's a good foundation. There are some moments involving the comedy, or some of the twists or the turns that are fun. I like the Dicta Bird. I like the stuff involving that character in the film. Uh, I like the scenes with Fred, bowling with his pals. I like the scenes where Fred and Barney are working together and they're friends. Although at the same time, even though their falling out really strengthens their friendship, it's something that you don't necessarily look for in a Flintstones movie. You want to see them together more than apart. And so that's another problem with the script, is that so much of the film just kind of wastes these two characters because they are at odds with one another for a good chunk of the runtime, and a good chunk of the screenplay. So it's just a misguided script. It's not completely totally terrible, but it's definitely misguided. I also feel like Bam Bam and the other girl, like Pebbles. Yeah, Bam Bam and Pebbles, their stuff in the script is really bad. But then again, they're not very strong characters anyway, but it's really terrible when it comes to the scenes involving those two. Thankfully, though, the script kind of realizes that and doesn't have them center stage or feature a lot of scenes with them. Probably for that reason, because they were like, "What are we gonna do with these two?" Um, the cast, though, I think it's a great cast, and see, that's a big reason why it's a time waster for me, is because of this cast, specifically John Goodman and Rick Moranis. Those two were born to play Fred and Barney. Uh, John Goodman, he mentioned how he felt like he was trapped in this role because Steven handpicked him to play Fred when Steven saw him acting on the set of Always, and he worked with John on that film. And because, Steven Spielberg is Steven Spielberg, like he couldn't back out of that. And so he just felt like he was kind of trapped in that role. But despite his trepidation, he really went all out with it, and he really gave it his all, and it really shows. Like John Goodman is just so jolly and jovial and fun to watch when he's Fred as who you expect Fred to be. When he's just a jerk, it's a different thing entirely. You don't want it. It's cringe inducing. But not because it's a bad performance, it's because it's too convincing when it comes to him being such an entitled prick. Um, but the scenes with him and Rick Moranis, when they are together, the chemistry is just off the charts. It's amazing. It's great. The two just work so well with one another. And Rick is remarkable too as Barney. Rick was just a perfect casting, because this is a guy who, in a lot of ways, is kind of a rag doll. He's kind of ran over and stomped on, and so on and so forth. But despite how pathetic his character can be at times, there's a certain endearing quality to him that you really do appreciate and you kind of admire. How he's able to persevere and look for the bright side despite things not being great, and things kind of hitting a rough patch, and Rick just handled that performance with just the perfect amount of charm and commitment, and it easily could have been something where he was just hamming it up, but no. And Rick, it helps too that he just has that personality naturally about him where you just like the guy and you want him to do well. So like the scenes between him and his kid, Bam Bam, like the scene where Bam Bam says "Dada," like it's genuinely heartwarming because Rick is just so good at playing those kind of roles. So Danny DeVito was considered to play Barney, but then he decided to pass on it, and that's what led to Rick eventually getting it. And I feel that it was just the perfect casting choice. I know that there were other actresses considered to play Wilma, like Gina Davis and Catherine O'Hara, but Elizabeth Perkins is eventually the actress who won the role. And you know what? I think this is honestly one of her best performances. It's definitely one of her more memorable performances to me. Like, I thought she was a really great casting choice to play Wilma. I think she's another standout in this cast. I think the chemistry that she has with John Goodman is really good too. And like the scene where she lets her hair down and is dancing to the B-52s at the club, like she's pretty sexy too. Like who knew that Wilma was such a fox? But yeah, Elizabeth Perkins, I really liked her performance as Wilma. So yeah, the main three, great. I mean, the casting couldn't get any better. I mean, John Goodman as Fred, Rick Moranis as Barney, Elizabeth Perkins as Wilma. All of them seemed like they just walked right off the cartoon and onto the big screen. Rosie O'Donnell, though, as Betty Rubble. What the hell? Like, what was that casting choice? It's crazy to me where you nail the casting for the first, like, three main cast members, and then you just completely just drop the ball and just fall flat in your face with the casting for Betty. Apparently, Rosie O'Donnell got the role because she was able to do a convincing imitation of Betty's laugh, and I'm like, that's not enough of a reason to cast somebody to play a role that they can mimic a laugh. And apparently there was some other actors that were considered, like Daphne Zuniga and Tracy Ullman. Like, Tracy Ullman is a much more talented performer. I would have loved to have seen her Betty. She would have nailed it. Or Daphne Zuniga probably would have worked too. But Rosie O'Donnell was just really bad casting and really brought the film down when it comes to scenes featuring her character or scenes that focused on, excuse me, I'm just, man, I just got a little bit of indigestion just thinking about Rosie O'Donnell in this movie. Maybe I'm just having flashbacks to her in Skin Tight S&M Lever from that movie I Said Eden, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, just terrible casting. I don't know what they were thinking with that. Especially when you had Tracy Ullman and you were like, no, we're going to pass on you for Rosie O'Donnell. Apparently Sharon Stone was actually supposed to play Miss Stone, and Nicole Kidman was also offered a role, or offered that role, but it ultimately went to Halle Berry. And Halle Berry was fine in that role as Miss Stone, this sexy secretary. Although I didn't necessarily buy the turn at the end where she's supposed to be a good guy. That didn't really vibe that well for me. You also have Kyle MacLachlan, who I really like. I'm a big fan of his, but this is one of his weakest performances of his career, is Cliff Vandercave. He's not the kind of guy to play a campy, over-the-top bad guy. He's the guy who plays like an oblivious mayor in Portlandia. He's the guy who can play a weird kind of detective. in like Twin Peaks, or Paul Atreides in Dune, guy trying to solve some quirky mystery in a small town, or an alien from outer space. He's not the guy to play your charming, suave, charismatic a villain you love to hate who's trying to screw over Fred Flintstone with business fraud. It's just not really the best casting choice. It just feels like he's just completely out of place in this. Um, Elizabeth Taylor's also in this as Wilma's mother, and I don't really have much to say about the performance. Like, the character was just one note gag the entire time. Oh, she's the mother-in-law. What a bitch. That's really what the joke was. Richard Mole was also in this as one of the guys who works at the quarry. Harvey Korman, he's in this as the voice of the Dictabird. Honestly, in a lot of scenes, he stole the show. Like, he was funny. It was like one of the funniest things about the movie is Harvey Korman. Jonathan Winters is also in it as this co-worker of Fred and Barney's. Lorraine Newman has a very brief cameo as Susan Rock. You have Hanna and Barbera themselves as various different characters. William Hanna plays a boardroom executive. Joseph Barbera plays a man driving a Mercedes. Jay Leno is in this as the host of Bedrock's Most Wanted, which I thought was a weird casting choice too. Like, Jay Leno is like the John Walsh type hosting a parody of America's Most Wanted. Okay, I guess. Sam Raimi also has a cameo in this as a Cliff Vandercave look-alike. Yeah, Sam Raimi. Just a complete random cameo. Like, you also have like the kids who play Pebbles and Bam Bam. Elaine and Melanie Silver as Pebbles. Hilner and Marino Sigerson as Bam Bam. Apparently, they're twins. The performances for both of them were pretty awful, especially the kid playing Bam Bam. Um, Cast, it's not as solid as it could be, but for the most part, pretty dang good. Especially when it comes to like the main three. The cinematography by Dean Cundy is great. It's Dean Cundy. Like, the man is a master of his craft. He's one of the most legendary and iconic cinematographers, not only of his time, but ever. And he does some really good work here, too, in the film. You can tell he was having fun. Having a good time doing the Flintstones movie. The editing by Kent Beta I also thought was really good. Definitely fit the whole vibe and the feel and the energy of the film very well. Added to the chaos and the cartoonish style of various different sequences. It was a good fit. And so was the score by David Newman. I thought that was a good fit to the film too, especially the rendition of the main, Flintstones theme, and some of the other original pieces that he did too. I thought were pretty good. Not one of my favorite scores of his, but still a good score. Still something that worked within the movie and wasn't too much of a standout in a negative way. And it's like a 91-minute long movie. That's with the end credits. Without the end credits, it's like an hour and 28 minutes. So it goes by at a good pace. It's not that long. It's not that boring. And the $46 million budget is on the screen and then some. Like, it was just fun to watch the movie again, just to see the costume design and the set design, the production design, art direction, and the effects. Just to see all of that, because so much of it was done practically, very few instances of green screen work, and it's a spectacle at times. It genuinely is. Like, it's a true testament to the craftsmanship of those involved with the production, who really put their heart and soul and everything into the movie. So that's why I think it's a little too harsh to say it's like 24%, like really bad, just absolute garbage, a total prehistoric turd. Like, I think that's too much. I don't think it's anywhere near that bad. And like I said, the original cartoon is not nearly as great when it comes to the writing either. I think it's something that, despite how misguided it is at times and how inconsistent it is, it's still got its heart in the right place, and it can still be a fun watch if you're in the right mood. But it's not something that I really watch over and over again or anything. Um, but I'm glad to have it in my collection, and I would recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it, or if it's been a long time, just to check out the effects and the set design, and just to see John Goodman and Rick Moranis play off of one another. But anyway, that's my review of the Flintstones, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.